All right, so I want to spend some time talking about the United States, the country that I love, the place where I pay taxes and I vote. So I expect certain things from the country that I live in. So why do we want to talk about this idea of the human soul, this God complex idea, and how does that relate to the workplace in terms of looking at discrimination? And so a couple of things I'd like to read to you. The preamble of the Constitution. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare for ourselves, and promote the general welfare for ourselves, to secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. We do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. The Declaration of Independence, paragraph 2, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, one of the things that I think is very interesting in both of those documents, it alludes to, talks about the fact that if we add that concept of wholeness, we understand that it's written in the Constitution, right? It's written as our Declaration of Independence, that we want to create an atmosphere where people can be whole. And so what we know is that we're a nation of contradictions, right? So we haven't always lived up to the best of ourselves. However, I think it is the aspiration, it's the work towards doing that has set us aside from other countries on this small orb called Earth. And so a couple of things I want to point out. One is that in 1863, that the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, right? So 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation is signed. Doing what for whom? And typically when I ask that question, the answer that people give me is that it freed the slaves. Now, that language or that way of speaking is problematic for me, because what we're doing when we say that it was designed to free the slaves, let's go back to this wholeness, right? Let's go back to this cracked soul. So what is a slave? A slave is typically considered property. It is considered a thing. And so one of the tricks, particularly for those white people who owned slaves in the United States, was that they were able to, the reason they were able to do some of those things, that they were able to keep those people in subjection, was because they did not see them as people, they saw them as things. And every time we have this conversation about the system of slavery, and we refer to those people as slaves, we are re-victimizing them because we're calling them things once again. And so one of the questions that I ask in my presentations is, were those things in the system of slavery? And the answer is no, they were not things. They were not things in the system of slavery. They were people. They were people with dreams and aspirations and hopes and wishes and desires and abilities to do things. And the system of slavery not only monitorized their lives, but also denied them access to being their whole selves. Right? So 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation is signed, giving freedom to those people who were in the system of slavery. 1920s, and in particular, August 18th, 1920, the women's suffrage movement comes to its most pinnacle moment in this part of history, and women get the right to vote. So finally, after all of this time, women get the right to vote and participate in this great representative democracy in ways that they had not before. And so, I am woman, hear me roar, rawr, which was actually coined quite later, but it was important that women were able to have the right to say, what was on their minds in our political system. All right? So, in 1924, the Native American Citizenship Act was signed. giving Native Americans the right to be American citizens. Pause for the irony. So one of the things that we find ironic is that since the founding of this nation, there's been this battle between the newcomers to this country and the other folks who are already here. And so finally, in 1924, Native Americans become American citizens. Now, there's a whole conversation that we need to have or could have about that particular point, but we'll come back to that later. But I want you to recognize that irony because it'll show up again. So then in 1964, what happens? So in the 1960s, the civil rights movement was going forward, and it reached one of its highest points in 1964 when it was signed into law, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? And so what basically that said, what that did was that eliminated segregation, particularly in federally funded or federally associated programs, restaurants, businesses, hotels, in public spaces. It said it was not okay to discriminate, which was to segregate. So the first thing that it did was that it ended segregation. The second thing that the 1964 Civil Rights Act did was that it defined discrimination. It made it a part of a legal process. And so 1964 is very important for those 2 points, as well as the fact that it lays the foundation for a lot of the rights that were to follow, right? And so this said that it was illegal to segregate, and it also defined discrimination in its legal terms. So that'll come back to us as well. Then in 1978, Native Americans get to practice their religion the way that they want without any federal or state interference in that process. Irony revisited. It's like Groundhog Day. Didn't we just say? Okay. So in 1978, Native Americans get to practice their religion the way they want. And the irony is simply that this nation supposedly was founded on religious ideas and beliefs, but Native Americans were denied that. And we'll talk about why that's important, particularly excuse me, particularly when we talk about this idea of wholeness, right? Excuse me. And then in 1990, what we recognize is that the Americans with Disabilities Act is signed, giving, and this is very interesting because people sometimes get this confused, right? So the Americans with Disabilities Act did not give special treatment to people with disabilities. It gave them equal treatment. It gave them equal access to goods, jobs, services, and money, the same access that everyone else had, but they were denied because we were not cognizant of those folks actually being able to contribute to our systems, both in government as well as in our organizations. And so the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act is very important when we start talking about how do these things add to human wholeness. And so what we recognize is that we've made some progress. We've also made some missteps. And there's a ways we have to go until we get to a point where we can create an environment where people have access to their wholeness. Now here is the difference, right? So I want to be real clear that I'm not saying that everyone needs to, that we need to create a system where everyone is exactly the same. But what I am saying is that in the past, we've had systems that have actually denied people access to their full humanity. Slavery was one of those systems. When women did not have the right to participate or have equal pay, and we still have that plaguing problem today, right? That denies them access to their 100% humanity. When Native Americans can't self-determine their own destiny, when it's legislated where they'll live, how much money, how much, all sorts of stuff, then that limits their ability to be their wholeness. Or when they have methods of being whole, and the larger culture says, we don't like those methods, so we're going to deny you access to the methods that you have developed to be whole, then that is a denial of humans' ultimate potential. And so these dates become extremely important. There are two dates that I want to pull out for us to have a conversation about, because these are plaguing issues, plaguing dates. So from 1863 to 1964 is 101 years. Now, one of the things that we don't put in context is what is significant about that 101 years. Now, in 1964, as Martin Luther King and others, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, a number of great folks were moving this civil rights agenda, they were getting feedback from the populace saying, wait a minute, slow down, you're going too fast. Change takes time. Well, it had been 101 years before we had actually started having, in federal legislation, some relief to this oppressive system. So 101 years passes, and people were like, Martin, you're going too fast. And that's when Dr. King said, well, justice delayed is justice denied. Because for 101 years, people had put up with these systems of Jim Crow, of these restrictive voting laws, with these laws that restricted where and how people could purchase homes and where they could raise their children and the schools they could go to. So over 101 years. Now, one thing I do have to say and I have to stress is that when we talk about this 101 years, this is a small piece of time. I did not want to start with the 200 years before this because I wanted to make sure that we had something that was that we could actually look at as it impacts us today. And so in this 101 years, what we know is that we added over 20 states to our union. To the United States, over 20 states were added in that 101 years. What we know is that the Model T Ford was invented in that 1 year. That people went from gas lanterns in their house to electricity in that 101 years. We know that the Industrial Revolution in the United States happened in that 1 year. That Henry Ford started the first assembly plant in that 101 years. What we know is that Edison, the light bulb, the telephone, all of these things were invented in that 101 years, but not everyone had the same access to that stuff in 101 years, and many of those things would have made or completed people, allowed them to continue to explore their wholeness. Right? And so what we know is that we had, a Great Depression, 2 world wars, maybe 2 conflicts, depending on how those things are described. But a lot of things happened in that 101 years. And so we have to recognize that as we look at our relations in the United States with our own people, that there's a delayed access to goods, jobs, services, and money for some folks, while other folks were accumulating, even if it was at a small increment, accumulating wealth, accumulating net worth, accumulating generational resources that could be passed down from generation to generation. And so those things become important. Can you imagine what slavery might have been like had slaves been able to get life insurance? Have those assets to pass down, to be in a profit-sharing mode. So the history would have turned out different, but our present day would have some different outcomes. So those are some things to think about. Another thing to kind of think about is, this 1924 thing where Native Americans become citizens, which is it's a bittersweet kind of thing, right? So they may be citizens, but what do they have to give up, or how do they share those things? And what did it take for that to happen? How many millions of Native Americans were slaughtered before this act was signed making them American citizens and giving them the protections of American society. When we were waging war on Native Americans, we were doing that as one country to another country. And so I find it very interesting that 1924 presents itself. Because, again, a lot of these thought processes, these slow reactions to the change in demographics have slowed people's recognition of their wholeness. And when you marginalize a people by systems, when systems marginalize people, it becomes very difficult for people to break out of those systemic problems and issues. And so what we see is a large rate of suicide, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, obesity, diabetes with Native Americans because they've been denied access to their complete and whole humanity. And so as we talk about this next piece, and we'll talk about discrimination and its impacts, we'll talk about how those things can help create human wholeness, how we can help people be complete. All right? So we'll do that in just a second. Thank you so much for your time so far. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.